Welcome to this seminar. We'll call it Integrating Migration into Development Aid, Lessons from Europe. My name is Mats Horsmar. I'm Deputy Managing Director for the Expert Group for Aid Studies, EBA. But today I'm your moderator. So this session is recorded and live streamed. There are emergency exits on both sides here. Locate them so that you know if anything should happen. But as I said, you're most welcome. We are discussing a policy issues which is central to Sweden, but we need to distinguish several layers or levels here. First, we have the political level, where ideologies and issues are discussed. Then beneath that, we have the policy level. When the government sets a policy, 2 years ago, the Swedish government set a reform agenda for Sweden, for Swedish aid, development assistance for a new era, freedom, empowerment and sustainable growth, where migration got a central position. And then a year ago, the global strategy for migration, focusing on return and readmission migration and also fighting irregular migration was set. So that's the policy area. And then we move to the implementation level where things are going to be done. And that's where we are at today in this discussion. Together with me, I have a distinguished panel. From my far end here, Jesper Bjarnesen from Nordic Africa Institute, where you are a senior researcher. You are writing on a chapter on the Danish experience. We have Jessica Schultz, senior researcher at Christian Michelsen Institute in Bergen, Norway, writing on Norwegian experiences. And we have Johan Schar, who is Associate Senior Fellow for the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, but also having had a lot of positions previously within Swedish Development Aid, head of Sida's humanitarian function. You've been heading bilateral programs in aid, and you were vice chair of the EBA for many years. And fourthly here, Henrik Malm Lindberg, who is deputy head of the Secretariat at the Migration Studies Delegation, DELMI, who is organizing this session. We are to discuss preliminary findings from a forthcoming anthology, which is a project jointly driven by EBA, DELMI, and something called EMN Sweden, European Migration Network Sweden, where experiences from Denmark, Norway, Germany and the Netherlands are to be described and discussed. These are all countries known for generous aid policies. They come from a rather open-bordered migration policies, but they have at different points in time shifted over quite drastically to very restrictive migration policies. So, Henrik, I turn to you first. Could you tell us a bit about this anthology? You're one of the editors of this, together with Iris Lutman. Why are we doing this now, and what is it about?
Good question, Mats, and thank you for moderating this event as well. It's a pleasure to be here in front of you and being part of this very important discussion. And as Mats told you, EBA, DELMI and EMN Sweden started out roughly a year ago with talks, roundtable sittings, seminars with primarily agencies, ministries in Sweden. And then we found the resources to start this anthology about half a year ago with 4 participating countries and leading scholars in each of these. Germany and Holland are not participating here today, so they have an airdropped stand-in, and that's me. And I'm also the editor of this volume together with my colleague Iris Lutman then. The theme of the anthology is to explore how different European countries with similarities to Sweden have linked international development cooperation with migration policy, and especially then how these linkages have been implemented and governed in practice. This is a recent marriage that has taken place in Sweden between these two policy fields. And we know that such marriages has taken place earlier and more tightly in the countries that have been mentioned here. How do these linkages turn out? When migration goal enter development aid sphere, what issues are the most important to address for policymakers, having done these linkages between these two entities? We will ask questions about development and migration authorities and agencies, how they coordinate between one another in practice. What does the division of responsibility look like? And as in all implementation research, it's important to know what key implementers are there and how their role has functioned in practice. We also want to set the focus on conditional and conditionality in the migrated-related commitments. Last but not least, we're also interested in the effects, long run or short run, that has been observed in evaluations and studies. More generally, we want to say something about the outcomes and lessons learned for Sweden especially, since it's both DELMI and EBA's aim to guide policymakers in this field. From a neutral and fact-based stance, what outcomes can be expected if you marry two fields like that? And this anthology will probably be published in March or perhaps in early April. The primary audience will be Swedish policymakers and practitioners in this field. We also hope that the results will be relevant for policymakers across Europe on the international level. But I'm not really sure it will hit the top list on Amazon, I'm afraid.
You don't have high expectations like that?
I have expectations that the right audience will read this anthology rather than the broad mass audience.
Wow. Great. Johan, I turn to you now. You have been involved in development cooperation for many years, and you have experience also from the field of migration. You've been thinking a lot about the role of migration in development. Could you give us some broad lines? How has migration issues been treated over some period in Sweden, but perhaps also internationally in development cooperation?
Yes, thank you. I think to a pretty limited extent, in fact. There has been long-term support to the ILO, for example, from Sida since decades, which was about the standards for labor migration particularly, and people were seconded to the ILO headquarters in Geneva and so on. But I think in terms of looking at migration from a much broader perspective as a dynamic force in social transformation and sort of trying to understand the role of development cooperation in that context, I think it's been quite limited. There have been ambitions and discussions and so on, and ideas and stuff written, but it has not very much been translated into actual development policy and action. There's been some more recently support regionally in Africa, I think, looking at the African, the integration of African labor markets and sort of support nations in facilitating labor migration between neighboring countries in Africa. So there's some of that, but I don't think it has ever really gained its position as a a well understood topic that has been sort of incorporated in development cooperation.
But now there seems to be a quite dramatic turn, and with a slightly different approach to it.
Yeah.
What do you think? How could an aid organization like Sida or any other aid organization, is it easy to sort of just take this on, or what kind of reactions, what kind of challenges does that entail?
I think it is challenging, and because what we're talking about now is a very narrow aspect of migration. If you go back and look at the Global Compact on Migration, the UN process, which was endorsed by states in 2018 in Morocco, which I did yesterday, I looked at what did the government say about that process when migration is talked about as a the need for safe, orderly, regular migration playing an important role for individuals, for their families, for the recipient country, for the sending country, contributing to social and economic development, also meeting needs in terms of the Swedish labor market and so on. So a very comprehensive framing of migration as a phenomenon. And of course what we are discussing now is this very limited and narrow aspect of actually what do you do to enable or encourage people to leave, to return to their home countries? And so I think we need to recognize that that's a very dramatic shift.
It's a shift, it's a limited part, but still, in this, and emerging from draft chapters, text, etc., I can sense like three ways or three approaches that you could see in sort of getting at these migration results with or through development aid. The first one is that you use aid and migration policy interventions to complement each other. You can think of rather direct interventions for return or reintegration. You could think of systems like ID control or border control or administration of return migrants or programs for reintegration. The coordination of this is often called a whole of government approach, that authorities from development as well as from migration collaborate, do things together rather directly. That's a first approach. A second approach is when aid more indirectly influences migration pressure, or meant to influence migration pressure, through broad socio-economic development or promoting stability in partner countries, to reduce irregular migration and improve the environment for return and reintegration. We label this as dealing with the root causes of irregular migration. You can think of creating jobs, developing the economy, promoting businesses and others. And then there's a third approach, which I place over here. When you use aid as leverage or condition for creating incentives for partner country governments specifically to receive or reintegrate their citizens, or for other matters within migration. So if we start with this first approach, the whole of government approach, Jessica, I would like to turn to you now. The cooperation between migration, it could be Minister of Justice and the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, or Migration Authority, or Development Aid Authority. What has that looked like in Norway?
I would say that in Norway, we don't have an overarching whole of government approach to migration and aid, migration management and aid. What we have are two actors that are sort of firmly in their own lanes. We have the Ministry of Justice on the one hand, with responsibility for immigration and integration, that has also been the front runner in a very consistent focus on return policy and return agreements during the past 20 years. So all of the coalition government platforms since 2005 in Norway have emphasized the importance of return and return agreements. Some of them have mentioned kind of vaguely the use of aid in order to secure such agreements, or the relationship between aid and those agreements. But the Ministry of Justice, through the Immigration Directorate, which has a unit on international cooperation, has established a kind of a pot of money. It's about 30 million Norwegian kroners a year, so it's not a huge amount. It's a drop in the huge aid bucket, but which they use in particular countries of migrant origin, strategic countries, to sort of facilitate return and readmissions. So that includes the collaboration we have also with Sweden and Denmark. I think in Iraq and in Somalia, there's support to the Somali Immigration and Citizenship Agency. And in various countries, they've used aid funds specifically. But what's really striking is that there's not sort of a coordination between these kinds of projects and the overall development strategies in the countries.
There was a period when there were more of coordination. There was a unit within the ministry.
Yes, so there have been, so these two lanes have kind of merged, I think, in there are three examples. The first is after the high number of migrant arrivals in 2015 and 2016. And at that point, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs established a migration section. And its purpose was to engage with the Valletta process, the global compacts on migration and refugees. It was also meant to negotiate return agreements and so on, and coordinate with the Ministry of Justice. What's really interesting about this section is that it was very, very busy for about 4 years. And then it was determined that this focus on migration control and return and so forth might be damaging to Norway's reputation, particularly as it was angling to get a seat in the UN Security Council. So that unit was disbanded, and the resources that were funneled to that unit were then shifted.
So in a way, return migration was seen as a liability for other parts of the foreign policy, is it?
It has in numerous times and examples been seen in that way. And the people who've done research on this point out that it's not only that you risk alienating with such a strong return policy, you not only risk alienating your partners in countries of migrant origin, but you also risk alienating other people in your own government. So there has been a lot of they call it berøringsangst in the MFA. Yeah.
What about Denmark, Jesper? I get the sense that it's more centrally driven in Denmark. Right. Is it so?
Yeah, thank you, Mats, and thank you for the opportunity. Well, on one hand, I would say that the experience in Denmark is similar to the Norwegian one, especially since the so-called refugee crisis of 2015-16, which became this more permanent idea of a migration crisis that really changed the outlook of the Danish government as well. So what has been happening since 2015 has been this somewhat of a scrambling, experimenting with different models of trying to coordinate migration issues within different parts of the government. So we've seen waves of sort of decentralizing that responsibility to several different agencies, and then this kind of return to a more centralized issue. And one reason that the approach right now is quite centralized is that migration has really, and I want to reiterate what Johan said, that this is a very narrow understanding of migration, right? So we're talking about unwanted, from a European or a Danish perspective, unwanted migration from the so-called global south to Europe, right? That's what now defines the way migration is being approached. So it's not this broader idea. That said, the centralized version of how to coordinate some version of a whole of government approach really comes from the way in which that kind of migration has become not just a low politics issue, but a high politics issue. So 10, 15 years ago, migration to Denmark and migration in general was a low politics issue in the sense that it was a part of the portfolios of different parts of the government, integration, asylum, and so on. Now it's become such a prestige, high politics issue that the coordination has really been taken over by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the foreign minister himself. Okay. And you can see that migration is really a key pillar in what Denmark now sees as the purpose of its development policy, which is why you now see that the portfolio of the Minister for Development has been integrated under the Foreign Ministry. Okay. So that post has disappeared.
In contradiction to the Norwegian case, it's more centralized, everyone line up behind the Foreign Minister.
That's right. And there's also a difference in the sense that I feel that the Norwegian example is more of an sort of traditional Nordic, Scandinavian idea of what the brand is to be the sort of not open borders, but a more generous, more sort of open philosophy, whereas Denmark has kind of proudly embraced, and I say this as a Danish citizen, maybe not, politics aside, but proudly embracing the brand that migration is something that should be restricted. So, for example, the former Minister for Migration, Inger Støjberg, who is now the head of a party called the Danish Democrats, when she was minister, the website of the ministry had kind of a counter, like a clock ticking, which represented every time the ministry implemented a restrictive policy on migration. They called it tightenings or stramninger in Danish. So it was advertised proudly, and there was a mini scandal when the minister posed with a birthday cake with the number 50 when the ministry reached the 50th tightening of the migration policy in Denmark. So it's become part of the Danish brand to proudly show itself as very strict on migration.
Henrik, are there other examples from the other countries, Germany, Netherlands, on this coordination? Could you say something?
There is
on that?
There is actually, and to reflect upon the former speakers here, something happened in 2015, because the year after 2016 in Germany, things also took for a change. At that point, Germany lacked a single, all-encompassing migration and development strategy, also due to the fact that Germany is a federal country, so it consists of like 20 länder, and then you have the central government coordinating. But in 2016, what happened then? There was a strategy and action plan on migration and development. It has a German name as well, but I failed to mention that. That was a milestone articulating a cross-government framework on these issues. And this strategy introduced, and they are explicit about it, a whole-of-government approach on this area, coordinating foreign, interior, development, and also other policy issues regarding 4 pillars, addressing the root causes on displacement, enhancing protection in regions, and enabling legal pathways, and 4th, supporting return and reintegration. So it was quite all-encompassing at that point. Then we have 3 coalition governments. Each coalition government from that period, 2016, up until the Merz government, sharpening and tightening this broader brand of different aspects of migration. So when we come to the latest turn in 2015, the coalition with Chancellor Merz together with the Social Democrats, they adopted a much stricter migration management stance, prioritizing control, return, conditionality, cooperation, but within this leverage framework.
We're getting back to root causes and conditionality, but I'd like to ask you one. You've been working in embassies. In embassies, different policy areas meet, and you need to cooperate. What does it take to have a functional cooperation between different policy areas? I mean, we see that perhaps the centrality, more giving orders, seem to be one way, but to have, I mean, if there are tensions, what does it take?
Well, there's a traditional tension between the consular section in an embassy that deals with visa applications and all of that, you know, which is really ring-fenced and does not appreciate any views or suggestions from anybody else in the embassy. I've been witness to that. But that's a completely different matter, obviously. But in this case, I think it's a bit of a challenge because some of the sort of migration-related proposals fit nicely within what development staff are used to do in embassies. If you look at the response from Sida to the new government's strategy, utvecklingserbjudande, the offer, you know, development offer from Sida, there are a number of areas which are sort of under the heading of enabling safe returns, enabling reintegration, and so on. And they are about you know, supporting human rights, ensuring social services, that means education and health, social protection schemes, economic inclusion, and so on. And these are sort of, you know, sit nicely in any development policy, and would obviously, if they are to be implemented, they cannot only be geared towards returning migrants, they have to be sort of offered to the population in general. You cannot discriminate between individuals depending on the label that they have. So I think that aspect of Sida's proposals is quite sort of fits nicely in what people...
And that's interesting, because we can now move to the discussion on root causes logic. I mentioned this earlier. I was placing this root causes discussion here center stage. It was placed center stage. Jessica mentioned the Valletta process, 2015. European, African, MENA governments got together discussing migration, and it went to a EU trust fund to combat irregular migration, which was heavily geared towards job creation, general socioeconomic development programs with a lot of funding. But this idea of tackling the root causes behind irregular migration, that has been heavily criticized by researchers. It's a false narrative. Researchers rather say that you should listen to the new economic labor migration theory, NELM, which basically says that families in poor settings, in low-income countries, take decisions as units. They decide to diversify their income sources by sending someone in the family or elsewhere to send back remittances. Researchers also claim that there are two major factors driving migration. One is the motivation to migrate, the other one is the resources you have to migrate. And if development cooperation contributes to general development in a country, you could either have increasing migration or decreasing migration, depending on how it affects these two factors, the motivation, the resources. So you need to be very specific with the programs to target especially. And even if you have just one program can have different outcomes at an individual level, because you don't know how people react. So it's a very difficult approach, this one. Jesper, Denmark, is this approach, the root causes logic, is it used? Is it proclaimed?
Well, as you said, Mats, I think across Europe, the focus on root causes was one of the first responses to the situation around the Mediterranean. It was one of the first sort of policy agendas that came out of the European panic around the so-called refugee crisis, and Denmark sort of aligned with the EU priority on that and worked mainly through also multilateral engagements in that sense. And I agree, as you say, that there's a fundamental flaw in the logic behind what root causes are. I've written about this in a book called Worlds Apart, which looks at the contrast between African and European perspectives on migration governance. And a lot of African actors, whether at the national or the multilateral level, have been saying all along that the only reason to kind of buy into the root causes discourse is that it is basically development cooperation as usual under a different banner in a way. So it doesn't really disturb a lot of practical implementation and cooperation. We just call it something else, right? So Denmark has been behind that. In the last 5 years, I think there's been an acknowledgement that, it doesn't really make sense to invest in broad-based development efforts to then say this will stop this very narrow kind of migration that we don't want coming to Denmark. It's very difficult to justify that connection. So Denmark has turned slightly away from that policy, and we can come back to that later. I just want to say that at the same time, especially at the EU level, Denmark is at the forefront pushing for increasingly restrictive measures at the EU level as well. For example, standing behind the new Italian sort of initiative to combine trade investment with migration conditionalities. And there is sort of a new version of the root causes logic saying that it will be an enabling environment to sort of engage with strategic partners that will then be open to different kinds of cooperation around migration management.
Mm-hmm. Before I come to Norway, maybe I could go to Henrik. Do you think I was representing this root causes logic in a fair way, or are there sort of elements that could be still functional? Was I too harsh?
You're never too harsh, Mats. No, I doubt that. I agree on the limitations of the root causes approach. What you can say is that the root causes approach also in one way can be attributed to root causes also depend on conflict solutions, I would say. So root causes has two branches. The first branch is opportunities and possibilities to migrate, but there is also this authoritarian states that enhances different types of restrictions towards their citizens, discrimination, oppression, and so on. And that's, in my view, also belongs to the root causes. And with development and development aid to conflict-ridden states is also a way to make these states a bit less fragile and a bit less authoritarian and oppressive. So that's the only thing I would like to chip in.
You notice this way of arguing that you can meet in African countries, that you first agree with someone, says, yeah, I totally agree, and then you continue talk and say something else. So I like that. I like that.
Can I just add one comment to that? I mean, the language here is obviously very important. The concept of a root cause, that's when you talk about the disease and things like that, a problem that has to be solved and addressed and so on. But what you present, looking at the sort of economic labor migration dimension of it all, is a very positive sort of something attracts people to go to places where they know they can find work and make money and support their families and so on. So it's framing the issue in a completely different way.
Jessica, if we go to Norway, you hear what Jesper says, but still, isn't it that somehow root causes logic is still there around?
I think it's less prominent, perhaps, in Norway than other countries, namely because in 2016, the MFA in Norway commissioned a study on root causes and got a quite critical research paper back, written by my co-author Katrina Taleras and Jürgen Carling, that was very skeptical of the root cause approach, and pointed out the multiple drivers of migration and so forth. So it could be that that because of that, there's more hesitance to kind of use it openly. That said, of course, exactly as in Sweden, development actors find it very useful as a sort of rhetorical device to point out that many of their the areas that they're already supporting are aligned with a migration management agenda. And an example of that is the Solidarity Fund that we had for about 4 years between 2021 and 2024 that had sort of ambivalent goals. It was established by the Labour government to increase funding to countries and regions of refugee primarily origin. And it was to support protection and this kind of thing. But it was also placed under the ambit of the immigration and integration theme in the government platform. So the Ministry of Justice was involved. So how do these two actors meet and decide on where it ended up being it ended up being sort of like old wine in new bottles, just shifting existing projects around, basically. But how were they to meet? Well, by identifying projects that kind of served the root cause.
So in a way,
logic.
we're back to the question of coordination.
Facilitates coordination, actually, but it doesn't like have any analytic purpose in determining what's supported or not, in a sense.
So we should rather go to sort of organizational theory and see how organizations react to shifting demands and how they decouple at times and sort of use different logics to place themselves in a new setting. Maybe this is something what is happening here. I don't know.
It could be.
You are the researchers. Yeah. Is it more to say on this root causes logic from the German or Dutch examples?
I think that from the German example, it's very visible in the document 2016 that I addressed earlier here, and to some extent also when it was operationalized by the government in 2018, the coalition government between the CDU and the Social Democrats, then it's less prominent in the documents and in the programs promoted after 2018. To some extent, it seems that the root causes approach is not really that prominent, and we'll come back to the conditionality issue later on during this discussion. I think there is some kind of shift here taking place in Germany, I would say, to put it shortly.
So if we compare the two approaches, we started with this coordination around rather direct interventions, rather direct activities for return reintegration. That is more prevalent in the portfolios today, and this generalized sort of usual way of doing development cooperation is shifting. Way, or Jessica?
I think it also depends on the country setting. So there are certain countries that have, especially following 2015-16 in Norway, sort of migration strategies for that particular country. Like Afghanistan is a good example. So there you will find different pieces of the puzzle put together into a migration strategy. And there you will find, of course, elements, vocational training and education, skills training, that kind of thing, being framed as supporting people so that they're not having to migrate or remigrate. But and then those kind of strategies will have different elements as well. So I mean, you do see it in certain contexts, but as an overarching logic, governing how resources are allocated, it's less prominent, I think.
Shall we move to the third area, which is then the leveraging, the using aid as either as carrot or a stick to get change the incentives of partner country governments, maybe. To what extent in Denmark, Jesper, then has this been used and is used? Is leveraging conditionality, is that a big thing in Denmark, is it?
Well, I would say I think we have to. I'm sure there will be quite a difference between the German and the Nordic cases in a way, because just of the size of the economies and the size of the support programs as well. So Denmark, as a bilateral actor, does not have a lot of stick-like leverage. There's not a lot to threaten with. If Denmark withdraws its support to a particular country, it's not really that big of an impact. So I think on the stick side of leveraging migration interests, I think Denmark mainly works through the European Union and sort of backs that approach in a way. The carrot side of leverage is more where Denmark is working actively, and we are seeing that strategy being sort of increasingly targeted and narrow. So for example, Denmark is opening new embassies in Tunisia, Rwanda and Senegal. On the African continent. And all these three countries have a particular migration story behind them, right? So Tunisia is a well-known sort of bottleneck a transit country on the North African coast. Rwanda is the object of both the British and the Danish attempts to externalize its asylum processing to Rwanda in different ways. And Senegal is famous, both kind of a sending country for migrants, but also, again, kind of a bottleneck on the West African coast. So you see that increased diplomatic and development cooperation is being directed towards strategic countries that have a migration-specific profile.
So you're saying that the totality of the development aid program is shifting in this respect?
Very much so. And what Denmark is choosing not to engage with, alongside Sweden, I would say to a large extent, is, for example, the sort of the conflict-affected difficult states to work with. So you see diplomatically, for example, that Denmark has withdrawn from the Sahel region, not just in terms of its development support. I mean, 10, 15 years ago, you would see maybe embargoes or temporary pauses on development support in a situation where the government is mishandling itself or whatever. But now you see actually Denmark withdrawing entirely, also diplomatically, from countries that are difficult to work with. So it's very much kind of a strategic selection of specific countries. It's a narrowing, slimming down of which countries Denmark wants to work with. And many of those countries have migration-specific sort of motivation behind that strategic choice.
Migration diplomacy is done between governments. Is there a change also in the way aid is delivered? More towards governments, bilateral, that is?
That's true. It's not for these three countries, for example, the support that is being offered to Tunisia, Senegal, and Rwanda is not, for example, support to civil society or to these broad-based social programs. It's rather government-to-government support. And the Danish foreign minister has proudly said that we are becoming less moralizing in our expectations to how that support is then handled.
Okay. Can we see similar movements in other countries? For instance, Norway?
Not in terms of the selection of countries and so forth, but I mean, Norway has had both positive and negative experiences using development aid as a carrot, I suppose. And those limited funds I mentioned from the Ministry of Justice is an example of very sort of targeted carrot approach to facilitate, to identify interests that the return government has and try and meet them with a specific project or intervention. And, you know, but it
We
also...
come back to the carrot issue. Henrik, Germany, Netherlands.
Well, I think
Yes,
there is a shift taking place, and it's taking place right now, I would say. So it's a very much floating materia. For example, the Dutch example, we can see during the last years there is a shift towards specific countries in terms of migration partnerships. That's the key term here, migration partnership. And this approach requires close coordination between the ministries of foreign affairs, the ministries of justice and security, but also the diplomatic services. What they essentially do is to get migration clauses into aid agreements and these international partnerships. For example, with partner countries like Morocco and Tunisia in the north of Africa, which is very, very prominent during the last years in the Dutch example. To take the example from the German, that's basically the same. The recent coalition government, the Merz coalition government, has explicitly said expanding readmission and migration partnerships using development cooperation, visa policy, and trade relations as levers in this kind. So they also include trade in this melting pot, so to say.
I don't know if I go to Johan with the EU trade issue.
Yeah, I think what's expected now with the big EU migration pact will be associated much more with conditionality in terms of EU development support. And of course, the EU has much more than, comparing to Sweden, for example, of supporting governments. So the leverage, if the EU sort of aid budget is used in this way, in a much more explicit way, I think that will be potentially quite a forceful instrument. Can I just add, when we are talking about these policies, including the EU policy, what is often criticized is the absence of safe migration routes as part of this package. I mean, we know that support to return and reintegration may be effective, and including the incentives that individuals may receive, may be effective if people know that there is also an opportunity for readmission and return and possibly double citizenships and so on. There's an interesting new Delmi overview of research just this year, which shows this, and I think the absence of safe migration routes means that people will continue to try to cross the Mediterranean, regardless of aid conditionalities and so on and so forth. As long as there is a labor market in Europe, people will continue to try to come here.
Now I come back to Norway and the carrot experiences, because I understood that Norway have had. Could send back failed asylum seekers to Afghanistan more than other countries have managed to do, and also to Somalia. Oh, yeah. Could you tell us about
why?
Why is that?
Well, it's also, they've had also more difficult experience with Ethiopia. So it hasn't been, there isn't a one sort of size fits all approach, but different factors, I guess, can be singled out, I guess, in these different contexts. I think with Somalia and Afghanistan, the possibility of returns has been facilitated by a very sort of long-standing presence and focus on return, both by the presence of immigration liaison officials on the ground in those, not in Somalia, but from Kenya, but also in Afghanistan. In 2015, while the development aid professionals were sent back, 2 immigration liaison officials were sent to Kabul. So that just really emphasizes the importance of this sort of long-term dialogue, but also sort of keeping things under wraps in a sense, not making a big deal about it, not making big threats. I mean, in the Afghan situation, we have, I wouldn't call it like a stick, but it was made very clear to Afghan officials that the development budget from Norway includes, as it does everywhere in the OECD, the expenditures for asylum seekers during their first year in Norway. So it's made very clear to Afghan authorities that this is a package deal. So the more Afghans that come to Norway, and the assumption here was that an effective return policy would also have a deterrent effect, then the less money is sort of left over for Afghanistan. So I'm not sure whether that in particular, but that was definitely had an impact, but that was definitely part of the discussions.
But long-term engagement, having people...
And in Somalia as well, a very long-term engagement, the identification of sort of the right partner, and in contrast to Ethiopia, so the Immigration and Citizenship Agency there needed certain kinds of support, capacity building and things like this around IDs, but also the recognition of the Somali passport. Here we're looking at mobility as an incentive. That was seen as really a positive thing in kind of greasing the wheels of cooperation, that that Norway supported their national ID center experts to come to Somalia, verify that Somali passports met international standards, and therefore sort of facilitated Somalis to be able to use their own passports, even though many of them might have dual citizenship, on sort of like a national pride ground to be able to use their own passports. So that was also pointed out to us as something that...
We have time for one or two questions from you in the audience. Please prepare your questions if you wish to put them. But in the meantime, we see that a long-term engagement, having staff in place, working with building relations seems to be part of this package where you get some results in sort of having a return migration. Is it so? Nodding, yeah. So apparently, but these sort of positive attitudes towards returning. We now have a country which is opening its border for return, which is Syria. Johan, I think you have given that a thought. What are the possibilities there?
Yeah, and I also suggested in our discussions around the anthology that Syria is obviously an extremely interesting case in terms of getting things right. You know, we all see we have Syrian citizens and Syrians in Sweden who are now, many of them are very keen to go back and sort of explore what opportunities are there for return. They want to return, but conditions are still so unsafe and so uncertain and so difficult that it is for most of them who are now rooted in Sweden, who have jobs and kids in school here and so on, now is not the time to do that. But to enable them to sort of go in a more what we used to call circular migration pattern of sort of exploring opportunities, maybe starting to build a foothold in Syria while not losing it in Sweden. If the government is able, and not only the Swedish government, but more generally, if policies are designed along those lines, I think that there will be opportunities for success.
Yeah.
We have a question coming from the audience, so we need to give you a microphone, please. It's coming there. Please
Hello.
say who you are, please.
Hi, thank you so much for this. My name is Beatrice. I'm a political advisor for Miljöpartiet, the Swedish Greens. And this has been such an interesting discussion on, marrying two different policy areas. I'm stuck with a question that I hope that you could reason a little bit around, which is, the aid policy area and what is actually categorized as aid. So if you look at these three strategies that Mats presented, especially the first thematic area and the third, within these areas, what is actually, for example, in line with the OECD DAC principles of what aid can be? Thank you.
DAC principles, who wants to give that a go? Jesper.
Yeah, well, I don't have sort of a detailed answer, but I can say that both on the part of the Danish approach, and I've heard a similar discussion in Sweden, this is something that is being raised continuously and being questioned. There have been sort of cases brought up as questioning whether the sort of the investments are actually following DAC rules or should be categorized as a different kind of intervention. So I can't give you detailed sort of examples from the Danish case, other than that I know that this issue is continuously being raised, that some of these sort of investments do not seem to follow DAC principles. The response from what I've seen from Danish representatives has been that it's not the incentives that are the problem or the investments, it's the criteria in a way. So there's along with a lot of other international frameworks, so there's kind of pressure to, I don't know, either renegotiate or at least sort of reinterpret international standards in different ways. And I would say that Denmark is on the forefront of pushing the limits on these kinds of things, but I can't give you more specific
the basic principle of the regulation OECD DAC, the Development Assistance Committee in the OECD, is that to count as ODA, overseas official development assistance, the objective needs to be helping a partner country to develop. If the main objective is a donor country migration policy issue, it cannot be counted as aid. But then there is a gray area. And Jessica, I think you know something about an initiative
Yeah, I don't actually know the details, but we did hear in our interviews that there's a lot of debate about this, right? The Ministry of Justice projects, for example, have been reimbursed by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs as ODA compliant, right? And I think without exception, if I'm not mistaken. But the question is, of course, is the primary purpose for development, or is just one of the purposes for development? I think that's where the gray area is, right? And the Somali example is a good one. Like, would the support to this immigration agency be on the government's priorities if not for the interest of Norway and other countries in facilitating returns? So that's a question.
We should wind up this session. I would ask you a final question, which you should answer rapidly, because we don't have much time, and that is, in this project, Johan is part of the reference group for this anthology, so he's also involved in that project. In this project, has anything surprised you so far? Henrik?
What has surprised me to some extent is how much 2015 plays a role in the policy formulation. Of course, I was aware that 2015, the refugee crisis, would have been a booster, but in that extent that all countries has shifted at that point, that surprised me.
Thank you, Johan.
Yeah, I agree, obviously, and I think maybe not surprising, but notable what I said in my first intervention here about the change, the complete change in framing of what migration is, from a very broad understanding to a dynamic force to this very narrow. What's been interesting, I think, is to see the differences between these four countries that are part of the study. For example, the German example where long tradition of labor migration and links with Turkey and so on seem to influence. There's quite a profound understanding of the sort of that aspect of migration, which may not be as prominent in the other countries.
Jessica?
Yeah, I guess I was surprised at how, despite all of the sort of pressures from the EU and, having Denmark and now Sweden as our neighbors, how sort of fast the Norwegian, at least from the MFA NORAD side, are holding on to their principles of what development cooperation should be about. But
yeah, yes, but you may say things that the others have said since you're the last one.
Well, I might, but I'll choose something else. I think not having done this kind of research before, it's surprised me sort of the human side of actors working within the different branches of the government who have to reconcile their own values with the sort of the policies, especially in a country like Denmark, where the policy side has become high politics. So this sort of human side of the grappling with what does this mean for my role as a professional, my personal values, working with these principles has touched me, actually. I think that was a surprise.
So with that, thank you. Jesper Bjarnesen, Nordic Africa Institute, Jessica Schultz, CMI in Bergen, Johan Schar, and Henrik Malm Lindberg. And thank you all for listening and contributing. The anthology, as said, is expected during the spring of 26, maybe March. It will be published by EBA, Delmi, and EMN Sweden. You can check our websites for information about that project and other projects, for upcoming seminars and for podcasts. So please do that. Thank you so much.